What if all you believed you knew about your family was untrue? What if, with the mere reading of a will, somebody who wasn't known walked in and said he was the real heir to a multi-million-dollar estate? And what if, just when the truth was finally settled, a single voicemail uncovered a secret that flipped the whole story on its head? This is the unbelievable story of Richard Dalton, his secret son, a $1 million fortune, and a DNA test that not only shocked an entire family, but changed their lives forever. Richard Dalton wasn't merely rich, legendary, a mighty entrepreneur, a celebrated public figure, and the mastermind behind the Dalton empire. He amassed a fortune of over $50 million for decades, with lucrative businesses, properties, lavish vehicles, and so much more. When Richard died, his family was anticipating a routine will reading. His wife, Margaret, and their 3 children, Michael, Elizabeth, and David, thought they would inherit the property. After all, they had remained loyal to Richard for years. But in the attorney's office, where relatives waited with expectant eyes, Richard's longtime lawyer read something no one anticipated. I, Richard Dalton, leave my entire estate, without exception, to my son, Daniel. Pandemonium erupted in the room. Who was Daniel? The family glanced nervously at each other. The eldest son, Michael, pounded his fist on the table. This has to be an error. My father never had a son named Daniel. The lawyer nodded his head slowly. I assure you this is no error. Richard left very clear instructions. The will was signed, notarized, and binding in law. The house, the wealth, the corporations, all of them belonged to a hidden son. Nobody had even known about Dot. The Dalton family estate towered like a castle of riches. Its marble columns, shining chandeliers, and gold-encased portraits spoke volumes of generations living like royalty. Beyond the gates, the reporters milled in crowds like vultures, hawking rumors of secret trysts, clandestine negotiations, and an empire waiting to be split. Inside, the atmosphere was charged. There wasn't just sorrow in the air, it was anticipation. Everyone was aware of why they'd come. Richard Dalton, the man who amassed a fortune of over $50 million, was dead. His hotel empire, plus cars and property, was at stake. His relatives, wife Margaret, oldest son Michael, daughter Elizabeth, and youngest son David, sat rigidly in the attorney's office. Each of them bore a combination of melancholy and excitement. Michael sat back in his chair, his jaw clenched. As the eldest son of Richard, he was sure that most of the estate would belong to him. For years, he had prepared himself to inherit the Dalton empire. He wore sharp business suits, commanded with authority, and never failed to remind anyone he was the true heir. Elizabeth, anxious and elegant, twiddled her bracelet. She wasn't as desperate for power as her brother was. She wanted money and admiration, but above all she desired peace in a family where they were always torn apart by pride. David, the youngest of them, leaned forward in his chair, gazing out the window. He had never been as driven as his brothers and sister, and he usually felt underappreciated. Nevertheless, he realized the inheritance had the potential to transform his life for good. And then there was Richard's widow, Margaret. She wore black and gazed at the ground with eyes that were impossible to read. She had stuck by Richard for decades of marriage, through wealth, scandals, and endless rumors of his cheating. She felt she was entitled to live out her years in peace, free of financial concerns. The room fell silent as the attorney, Mr. Stevenson, a white-haired old man in a thick leather folder, cleared his throat. We are here today to read the last will and testament of Richard Dalton. The rustle of papers seemed louder than thunder. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum. Mr. Stevenson began with the formalities. The date, the signatures, the legal acknowledgments. The family barely listened. They wanted the numbers. They wanted to know who got what. Michael smirked, leaning closer to Elizabeth. Just watch. Father knew, I'm the only one who can handle the empire. Elizabeth rolled her eyes but said nothing. David whispered under his breath. We'll see. And then, it happened. Mr. Stevenson read slowly, each word slicing through the silence. I, Richard Dalton, being of sound mind and body, do hereby leave my entire estate, without exception, to my son Daniel. The room erupted. Michael shot up from his chair, his face burning red. What? Who the hell is Daniel? Elizabeth gasped, covering her mouth. David blinked in shock, unable to process what he had just heard. Margaret's voice broke as she insisted. There's some error. Richard never had a son by the name of Daniel. But Mr. Stevenson didn't bat an eye. He held up the signed will for all to view. This is Richard's official will. It explicitly states Daniel as the sole beneficiary. Michael charged over to the lawyer's desk, his fists at his sides. I don't believe this. My father would never do this to us. Elizabeth shook her head in shock. Daniel? Who's Daniel? Where did he appear from? David cursed under his breath. All of it vanished. The widow, Margaret, sat paralyzed, her hands shaking. She mouthed Richard's name in a prayer, but she got no response. The word Daniel remained suspended in the air like a phantom. No one had ever heard of him. No family get-togethers. No picture. No hushed-up tales. And here he was, signed into the will as the person who would inherit everything. Michael slammed the lawyer. This must be a fraud. Somebody deceived him, coerced him, undid him. My father was an old man. He may not have been thinking at all. Mr. Stevenson shook his head emphatically. Richard was as clear-headed as a bell when he signed this document. I was there. I saw him do it. Margaret's eyes began to brim with tears. 50 years of marriage, and he leaves everything to a stranger? Elizabeth struggled to calm her breathing. If Daniel is his son, that's meaning father led a secret life. A secret child. This has nothing to do with money. It has to do with betrayal. The room fell into an uproar. Michael raged about contesting the will. Elizabeth insisted on explanations. David grumbled acidly about lost years. Margaret sat in awful silence. Finally, Mr. Stevenson held up his hand. The will is clear. Daniel stands to inherit the whole of the Dalton estate. Until otherwise proved, the law is with him. The family was stunned. For the first time, the influential leader Daltons were powerless. Their future depended on a name none of them had ever heard before. Outside the law firm's office, rumors started circulating. Journalists got wind of the scandal. Headlines blazed across newspapers and TV screens. Debiocho is Daniel, secret heir to the Dalton fortune. Dalton family betrayed, multi-million-dollar empire at stake. Neighbors wondered. Friends asked questions. Business associates questioned the legacy of Richard. The Daltons, who were once invincible, were now in the middle of a scandal that could tear them asunder. And somewhere out there, a young man named Daniel, unaware of the storm he was walking into, was about to meet the family he never knew he had dot. As the family stormed out of the office, Michael's voice echoed in the hallway. This isn't over. Whoever this Daniel is, I'll make sure he never takes what's mine. But little did Michael realize, the DNA test soon to come wouldn't only verify Daniel's identity, it would reveal secrets so outrageous, the whole family would regret opening that will in the first place. Daniel's name was no longer a shadow anymore. He was soon going to be the most menacing threat the Dalton clan had ever encountered. Not for greed, but because the truth had finally knocked on the door. Days later, Daniel showed up at the Dalton mansion, a young man in his late 20s, attired in modest fashion. His nervous eyes betrayed his uncertainty. He told me his tale. His mother, who had died recently, had left him a letter. In it she admitted that Richard Dalton was his biological father. She had raised him by herself, never mentioning Richard to him, or maybe, as Daniel intimated, Richard had known, but had never mentioned it. Daniel had lived on little. He had never asked for money, never even dreamed of it. And now, out of nowhere, the world began calling him the heir to millions. Not everybody was willing to accept it, however. Michael, Richard's oldest son, accused Daniel of being a charlatan. Elizabeth, though tender in spirit, agreed that there must be some sort of mistake. Even Margaret, Richard's widow, struggled with sorrow and with rage. However, Daniel kept his cool. I didn't come here for money. I just want to know the truth about my father. And about myself. But true or false, the law was on his side. The will was clear as crystal. The Dalton house had never seemed colder. Within days of the reading of the will, the estate was already in transition. There were security guards at the gate. There were reporters parked outside, and talk of betrayal was whispered in the halls. For the Dalton family, the name Daniel was poison. A stranger who had the audacity to take what they felt was rightfully theirs. But for the rest of the world, Daniel was an enigma. A headline, a living drama that everyone was eager to see play out. And on a still Tuesday morning, that enigma drove right through the Dalton gates. Daniel did not come in a limousine, with lawyers and bodyguards, but in a dented old car with worn-out paint. He climbed out hesitantly, his stance uncertain, his attire unpretentious: jeans, a plain shirt, scuffed shoes. The employees who had worked in the mansion gawked. This was the guy who now owned the multi-million-dollar estate. This was the secret son of Richard Dalton, the man they had worked for devotedly for years. Daniel straightened the strap of the old leather bag across his shoulder and approached the huge double doors. He paused, drew a breath, and knocked. Moments later, the door creaked open. Elizabeth stood there, her eyes narrowing as she scanned him from head to toe. "You're Daniel?" she asked coldly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, I'm Richard Dalton's son. At least, that's what I've been told." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. Without a word, she turned and walked back into the mansion, leaving the door open. Daniel entered, the weight of the moment bearing down on him like chains. The family was already seated in the grand living room. Michael stood tall, arms crossed, his glare capable of cutting glass. David slumped in a chair, his face unreadable. Margaret sat on the sofa, her face white, her hands clasping the armrests as if holding herself together. As Daniel walked in, the air became thicker. Michael was the first to speak. "So, you're the one, the thief, the fraud, the so-called son my father apparently cared more about than his real family." Daniel's voice trembled, but his words carried sincerity. "I never asked for this. I didn't even know about Richard until very recently. My mother, before she died, she left me a letter. In it she explained the truth, that Richard was my father. I had no idea. I came here only to know who I am." Elizabeth folded her arms. "And yet, somehow, father left you everything. How convenient." Daniel shook his head. "I didn't come here for money. I was raised on it. I've spent my entire life not knowing this family. I just want to know the truth about him, about me." But Michael's fury only escalated. "Don't act so innocent. You've already ruined us. That will, that fortune, it's ours. My father built it for his true children. You don't belong here." Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze turning to Margaret. "Mrs. Dalton, I wouldn't want to be disrespectful. I didn't come here to take anyone's place. I only want to know the man who was my father." Margaret's lips quivered, her eyes welled with tears, but her voice was as cold as ice. "Listen to this, Daniel, if you really are Richard's son, then you are evidence of his betrayal. Every time I glance at you, I will see the lie he walked around with for decades. You aren't family, you are a wound." Words sliced deeper than a knife. Daniel's head dropped, struggling to maintain his cool dot. The Daltons were wealthy, but Daniel grew up in darkness. His mother, Anna, brought him up alone in a small town. She never mentioned Richard, never said why he was gone. Daniel lived plain, taking odd jobs, barely making ends meet to cover school, and hoped for a future beyond poverty. It wasn't until Anna's last days that the truth was revealed. On her deathbed, she gave it to him in a sealed envelope. Her hands were frail, her eyes brimming with tears. "Daniel," she whispered, "I never wanted to saddle you with this. But you should know, your father was Richard Dalton. He couldn't be here, but he loved you in his own way. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The letter within did so. There was Richard's name, and private information known only to a father. Anna had kept the secret all those years, sheltering Daniel from the intrigue and scandal that came with money. When Daniel first heard his name being read from Richard's will, he was as surprised as anyone. He had not asked for this wealth, but destiny had put him in the limelight. Meanwhile, back in the mansion, the air was charged with tension. Michael paced the room like a hungry lion, waiting to pounce. "You want us to believe this fairy tale? A letter? That's your evidence?" Daniel dipped into his bag and drew out the envelope, setting it carefully on the table. "This was the last thing my mother gave me. She would not have lied. And the will? It's not mine, it's Richard speaking." Elizabeth looked at the letter, her face conflicted. She wanted to believe, but family loyalty stood in the way. David finally broke his silence, his tone low but biting. "Perhaps it is. Perhaps father did have a son. But if so, why leave everything to him? Why exclude us entirely?" The query hung in the air. None of them knew. Slowly Margaret stood up from the sofa. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Because Richard loved him best. Because he loved her best." Her fingers shook as she closed the door behind her, her tears echoing down the corridor. The accusations, the rage, the sorrow, all of it meant to engulf Daniel. But he braced himself. I can't erase the past. I can't erase what Richard chose. But I don't want war. I don't want enemies. I want to know the man who was my father. And if you'll permit me, I want to know you too. But Michael sneered, know us? You'll never be one of us. You can have his blood, but you'll never share this family. Not with me around. Elizabeth looked away, torn. David's eyes narrowed, suspicious. Daniel understood then that regardless of how sincere his intentions were, the Daltons would never consider him. They would never see him as a son, a brother, family. He was the intruder who took their world. And yet the reality was irrefutable. His presence had redefined the Dalton legacy. As Daniel stepped out of the living room, Michael grumbled under his breath. DNA test. That's the only way. And when it shows you're nothing but a liar, you'll wish you'd never set foot in this house. Daniel hesitated at the entrance, his heart weighing but his voice calm. If that's what it takes to establish who I am, then so be it. The battle had started. And soon, science itself, the DNA would determine the destiny of Daniel, the Daltons, and the million-dollar empire. The Dalton kids weren't going to let a stranger steal the empire their dad constructed. They retained lawyers, lodged protests, and demanded proof. That's when the court instructed a DNA test. Using individual items belonging to Richard, hair from a brush, things sealed and authenticated, the test would ascertain once and for all if Daniel was indeed Richard's son. The weeks in suspense were anxious. The media had picked up on the story, and tabloids splashed headlines. Secret son claims $50 million estate. Family fortune torn apart by DNA test. The day arrived at last. The family was reunited, eyes glued to the sealed envelope. The lawyer's voice rang out as he read. The probability of paternity between Richard Dalton and Daniel is 99.9%. The room went quiet. No one could argue the point anymore. Daniel was, biologically, Richard's son, and in the blink of an eye, Daniel legally inherited everything. The Dalton mansion was no longer a house. It was a war zone. Since Daniel's arrival, the family barely dared to look at one another with suspicion. Meals were eaten in silence, every glance charged with hostility. Yet there was something that united Michael, Elizabeth, David, and even Margaret: refusal to acknowledge Daniel without evidence. And Michael, proud, furious, and determined, made sure the world knew it. The first time Michael spoke to the press, his words spread like wildfire. Standing in front of the mansion gates, cameras flashing, he declared, "This so-called Daniel is nothing but an opportunist. He's using a letter from his deceased mother to steal what belongs to us. My father would never leave his empire to a stranger. Until there is DNA evidence, we will battle this in court." The reporters lapped it up. Headlines flashed: Dalton heirs deny secret son. Demand DNA proof. Family fortune on the line. Truth or fraud? Within days, the private soap opera had turned into a public spectacle. Talk shows speculated. Tabloids made up theories. And the world became fixated on one question: was Daniel indeed Richard Dalton's son? The pressure mounted too great to be disregarded. Lawyers fought back and forth, yet the judge finally reached an end to it. A DNA test would finally put the issue to rest. The test would not just use Daniel by itself. It would cross-match his DNA with Richard Dalton's stored personal effects: hair follicles from his brush, skin cells from a razor, and even antiquated medical records. All would be treated in controlled environments to prevent forgery. For Daniel, it was an opportunity to demonstrate what he had just learned about himself. For the Daltons, it was their final attempt to unmask him as a fake. The date had been set. The count had started. As the world argued over his identity, Daniel battled with doubts in his own mind. Late at night, he would sit by himself in the guest bedroom of the house. Though guest was not quite how the family treated him. He looked at the letter his mother had written, tracing her faded script with his fingers. What if they're right? What if the letter was wrong? What if Richard wasn't my father? The idea scared him. He wasn't seeking fortune. He wasn't seeking authority. He merely wanted to belong, to discover the truth. But the threat of being revealed as a fake, even inadvertently, haunted him. In the meantime, Michael planned like a war general. He met with attorneys, pored over the will, and even put private detectives on Daniel's trail to uncover secrets in his past. Elizabeth, torn between skepticism and quiet curiosity, grew restless. Part of her wished Daniel was proven false, so life could return to normal. But another part of her wished, maybe, just maybe, Daniel was telling the truth. David remained quiet, sitting on the sidelines. He was not as vocal as Michael, but deep inside, he too wished the test would wipe Daniel out of their lives. Margaret did have the worst of it though. She had spent 50 years of her life sharing a marriage with Richard. If Daniel existed, it would mean that her husband had deceived her for half a century. If not, then someone had plotted to embarrass her family. Either scenario meant that her world was shattered already. The world's fascination grew closer to the day of the DNA test. News anchors talked of nothing else. The Dalton scandal dominated the year's headlines. Paparazzi tailed Daniel everywhere, taking pictures of him at the supermarket, at the lawyer's office, even strolling through the park. Strangers on the internet took sides. Some referred to Daniel as a liar, a con man. Others referred to him as a victim, a man thrust into war that he never sought. The mansion gates were a circus. Fans, detractors, reporters, all yelling, all awaiting the truth. Daniel could hardly catch his breath under the scrutiny. At last the day came. The family and Daniel were taken to a private medical center under court order. Security was tight, reporters were camping outside, and the atmosphere was suffocating. Within, the cold white rooms reeked of disinfectant and terror. The judge personally supervised the proceedings, making sure no one interfered with evidence. Daniel waited in a chair, his hands shaking as a nurse readied the swab. He closed his eyes as the cotton swept across the inside of his cheek. It was painless, swift, though it felt like the weightiest second of his existence. Down the hall, the technicians maneuvered Richard's stored items with care. They labeled each sample, sealed it, and stored it. There was no room for foul play. Michael stood observing, arms folded, grinning at fake confidence. Enjoy this little moment of yours, Daniel. Within weeks the world will know what you truly are. Daniel looked at him, his tone composed but firm. The truth doesn't need weeks, Michael. It already exists. We're just waiting to see it. The results wouldn't be ready for several weeks. And in that time, the Dalton family spiraled deeper into chaos. Michael grew more aggressive, appearing on talk shows, giving interviews, calling Daniel a parasite. Elizabeth withdrew, refusing to speak to reporters, her mind plagued with conflicting emotions. David caroused wildly, attempting to drown the scandal in booze and all-night distractions. Margaret shut herself up in her bedroom, turning away visitors, her sorrow a silent tempest. And Daniel, he took it all in silence. Every slight, every gossip, every snap of a camera. He continued to work at a local homeless shelter, determined not to be defined by money. He repeated to himself again and again, the truth will come. The truth will come. The day the results came was like Judgment Day. The family once again converged upon the lawyer's office. Cameras were forbidden, but tension was so intense, it seemed as if the walls were watching. The attorney, Mr. Stevenson, held the envelope in his hands, sealed. The judge sat close beside him, prepared to enforce whatever the findings indicated. No one spoke, no one breathed. At last, Stevenson opened the seal and unfolded the letter. His voice was firm, but his words rattled the room. The likelihood of paternity between Richard Dalton and Daniel is 99.9%. The silence was deafening. Elizabeth's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. David's eyes went wide in horror. Margaret closed her eyes and wept silently, great tears flowing down her cheeks. And Michael's face paled, his jaw dropped, his whole body shaking with fury. No, this can't be. It's fixed. It has to be. But the judge cut him off. The tests are valid. Daniel Dalton is indeed Richard Dalton's biological son. The will is valid. The estate is his. Daniel sat in silent shock. It was official. The man that he had just found out about was indeed his father. The fortune, the empire, it all belonged to him. The news crushed the Daltons. Michael burst out of the room, yelling that it was a trap. Elizabeth cried softly, and David just sat silently in shock. Margaret, Richard's widow, glared at Daniel with sorrow and anger. The empire Richard created was no longer theirs. Decades of devotion, Family moments and sacrifices were now worthless. The Daltons were broken. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself living a life he did not want. Lawyers, accountants, reporters. Everybody engulfed him. Strangers fawned over him like royalty. And he had never felt more alone. One late evening, sitting by himself in the mansion, Daniel's phone rang. A voicemail had been left by a number he did not know. The voice on the message quivered. Panicked Daniel, "You don't know the whole story. Richard wasn't the man you think he was. Be careful." Shivers ran down his spine. What was it about? Who was telling him this? Outside, the headlines went wild. DNA confirms secure. Son Daniel inherits everything. Dalton family shattered by truth. But Daniel walked out of the office building, his phone vibrating. Voicemail from a number he didn't know. He hit play. A trembling, fearful voice whispered, "Daniel, you don't know the whole story. Richard wasn't the man you think he was. Be careful." Daniel came to a halt, the crushing weight of his new reality bearing down. The DNA had verified the truth. But the voicemail hinted at something even more sinister. A secret that would alter everything again. Daniel Dalton believed the horror was finally over. The DNA test had spoken. Scientific, incontrovertible, absolute. He was the son of Richard Dalton, the legitimate heir to the empire. The court had ratified it. The media had anointed him. And the family, although livid, had no option but to accept it. But just as the dust started to settle, fate handed him another bitter twist. One that would unravel all he believed about himself. It started as a voicemail. Daniel sat by himself in the mansion library. Late one evening, the oak bookshelves loomed above him, crowded with books his father had amassed over decades. He had been reading through them, looking for some piece of the man he never knew. His phone vibrated. An unknown number. A new voicemail. He clicked play. The voice was trembling, frantic, urgent. "Daniel, you don't know the whole story. Richard wasn't the man you think he was. The will, it's not what it seems. Be careful, they'll come after you if you dig too deep." And then silence. Daniel stood stock still, his heart pounding. Who was this? What were they talking about? The will had already been confirmed. The DNA test had confirmed everything. But the warning felt real. Too real. He played the voicemail repeatedly, his head reeling. The words kept playing like a jinx. The will, it's not what it seems. The following morning, Daniel hurried to Mr. Stevenson, the family attorney. "I received this voicemail last evening," he explained, passing on the phone. "Someone is telling me the will could be fake. A forgery? How can that even be possible?" Stevenson scowled, paying close attention. "That's a very serious charge, Daniel. An extremely serious one. Richard's will was signed, sealed and notarized. I witnessed it when it was written out. But might someone have tampered with it?" Daniel inquired. Stevenson paused. "It would be almost impossible, but not quite. Ambitious families have ambitious enemies. If someone were to tamper with the will, they'd have to gain access to Richard's private papers. His signature, his seal." His words faded away, but his eyes gave him away. Daniel leaned in. "Then we need to know the truth. If my father actually wanted me to inherit, I'll fight for it. But if someone tampered with his wishes, then I'm living a lie." Stevenson let out a sigh. "There is one man who may know. Someone who was closer to Richard than even I was." "Who?" Daniel demanded. "Henry Whitmore, Richard's best friend and business associate. He disappeared from the headlines years ago. But if anyone is in on the secret, it's him." Finding Henry Whitmore was not simple. He had withdrawn to a remote estate just outside the city, away from the maelstrom of the Dalton name. When Daniel finally faced him, Henry was an old man now, his eyes clouded but still smoldering with secrets. "I know why you're here," Henry said, before Daniel even spoke. "You want to know if that will is real." Daniel's stomach dropped. So the voicemail was right. Henry sighed, resting on his cane. Richard was a complex person, brilliant, cruel, and egotistical. He loved his empire above all. He loved many women. And yes, Claire Carter was one of them. "I don't have any doubt in my mind that you're his son. The DNA confirmed that. But the will? That's a different matter." Daniel's throat dried up. "What are you saying?" Henry narrowed his eyes. "Richard told me something in confidence not long before he died. He said he intended leaving the empire equally among Margaret, Michael, Elizabeth, and David. He said he would provide for you, but not leave you everything. He knew the riot that would break out." Daniel recoiled. "But the will gives me everything." Are you telling me it was a forgery? Henry nodded slowly. I think so. Something was tampered with on Richard's papers after his death. Someone with access. Someone who wished to spark this war. Daniel returned to the Dalton mansion with Henry's revelation. The family was already assembled in the parlor, seething with bitterness. Michael sneered upon Daniel's entrance. What now, little brother? Come to gloat over your triumph? Daniel's words cut through the tension. I think the will was forged. The room exploded. Elizabeth gasped. David laughed in shock. Margaret gripped her pearls, and Michael's sneer disappeared. What did you just say? Michael demanded. Daniel repeated Henry Whitmore's words. The family sat in shock. Although they all reacted differently, Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. If this is true, then none of us know Father's true motives. David shrugged. Frankly, it sounds exactly like Father. Leave us in disarray. Margaret breathed. Forged. But who by? Michael, though, blanched. For the first time, he was at a loss for an insult. No insult. No attack. Only silence. In the succeeding days, suspicion spread like poison. Who stood to benefit most from changing the will? Daniel was the likely culprit. After all, he took everything. But his shock had been too raw, too sincere. Elizabeth quietly wondered if Stevenson, the attorney, had been coerced, or worse, in on it. David, in his inebriated rants, blamed Michael himself. You wanted everything, didn't you? What if you tried to manipulate the will, but it went haywire? Margaret remained quiet, her heart shattering. With each new discovery, she was pulled further into despair. And Daniel? He could no longer rest. The voicemail bothered him. Henry's words ring in his head. If the will was a forgery, then who had planned this nightmare? And why? Late at night, Daniel went back to his father's study. He searched the desk drawers, looking for anything that would reveal the truth. At the bottom of a drawer behind expired receipts, he discovered a second envelope, sealed, with Richard's handwriting, private to be opened only if questions arise. His fingers trembled as he opened the seal. There was a letter, dated mere weeks before the death of Richard. It said, if you are reading this, it means that there is doubt. My empire is not for one, but for all. Divide it fairly, or you will kill each other. Daniel let the letter fall to the floor, his heart pounding. Richard had never planned on one heir. The will that declared him sole beneficiary was a fraud. The next morning, Daniel gathered the family. He set the letter out on the table, the last words of Richard Dalton glaring at them. This is the truth, Daniel declared. Father wanted us to share everything. But someone altered the will. Someone wanted us at war. The room went quiet. Every Dalton staring at the others in suspicion and fear. Michael was frightened for the first time. Elizabeth's gaze went to Stevenson, the attorney. David spat under his breath, and Margaret closed her eyes, allowing tears to stream down her face. Daniel's voice broke through the commotion. The DNA established who I am. But now we have to establish who betrayed us. Until we identify the forger, none of us can be winners. And in perfect timing, Daniel's phone rang again. Another voicemail. Same anonymous number. He played it. The voice this time was colder, more menacing. You've gone too far, Daniel. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. The room fell silent. The battle for inheritance was no longer about money. It was about survival. The following day, a woman arrived at the mansion. She was Clara, Richard's business partner for many years. She was tired, carrying secrets. Clara told the astounding truth. Yes, Daniel was indeed Richard's son. The DNA could not lie, but Richard had never wanted Daniel to take it all. In fact, the first will shared the estate among all his children, both legitimate and illegitimate. So what went wrong? Following Richard's death, the will had been tampered with. An imposter had created a new one, eliminating Margaret and the children, and leaving everything to Daniel. And the mastermind, none other than Michael, Richard's oldest son. The Dalton dynasty was on the brink of collapse. The DNA test had confirmed Daniel's bloodline. The forged will had ignited suspicion, and the ominous voicemails hinted at secrets, darker than anyone dared imagine. Now, the truth was closing in. And the truth, as always, was far more dangerous than the lie. The family sat in stunned silence after hearing the second voicemail. You've gone too far, Daniel. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. The words lingered like smoke in the air. Michael paced furiously. Elizabeth sat frozen in thought. David poured himself another drink, and Margaret quietly wept. Daniel's jaw tightened. He refused to be intimidated. Whoever this is, they're scared. Scared of the truth coming out. Which means we're close. Michael snapped. Close to what? Destroying this family once and for all. Maybe that's been your goal all along. Daniel stared at him. The only one ruining this family is the one who forged the will. Perhaps you should take a look in the mirror. Michael moved forward, but Elizabeth stood between them. Stop, both of you. It isn't just about money anymore. Someone is toying with all of us. Resolute about uncovering answers, Daniel sat again with Henry Whitmore. The elderly business partner hesitated, but eventually admitted what he did know. Richard's health was deteriorating faster than people even realized. Henry went on. He had weeks left at most. In his last days he wrote letters, notes, and instructions. He desired peace, not war. But after Richard died, some documents vanished from his study. I think someone in this house, or someone close to it, tampered with them. Daniel asked, but who had the power? Who had the freedom? Henry gave him a tired, long stare. Someone who shared the same roof. Someone who had everything to gain from casting suspicion. That evening, Daniel questioned Margaret in her bedroom. She was frail. An old woman overnight from betrayal. Mother, he spoke quietly. For although she wasn't his mother by blood, he couldn't think of calling her anything else. Did you know about the forgery? Margaret's eyes welled up with tears. She shook her head so hard. No, Daniel. I didn't touch anything. But I thought something. After Richard passed away, I saw Michael rummaging through his study late one night. Papers scattered all over the place. He told me he was sorting things out for the lawyer. But I didn't ask him. I was too devastated. Daniel's heart thudded. Could it have been Michael all this time? Daniel required evidence, so he placed a trap. With Stevenson's assistance, he organized a clandestine meeting in the study of the mansion, saying he had uncovered still another secret document of Richard's. He invited the whole family to know about it. That evening, while others slept, Daniel quietly observed the study in the darkness. Hours went by, then footsteps. Michael came in, looking furtively around. He went directly to the old desk of Richard, opening drawers, digging through papers. His fingers shook as he looked, muttering, "Where is it? Where did he stash it?" Daniel appeared beside him, searching for something. "Brother?" Michael turned, his face ashen. What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," said Daniel. "Unless you've been the one playing with father's papers all along." Michael's mask broke. Years of smugness crumbled into desperation. "Fine," he snarled. "Yes, I modified the will. Yes, I ensured that your name was signed as sole heir. But don't imagine for 1 minute I did it for you. I did it to bring you crashing down. To have the world crown you king, only to reveal you as a charlatan and see everything crumble around you. It was meant to break you, Daniel, not make you more powerful." Daniel's gut fell. "You forged father's will. To destroy me?" Michael's face flamed with insanity. "You think you belong here? You think you're worthy of this family, this business? You're nothing. A mistake. A shadow. I couldn't let you take what was rightfully mine, so I made you lose it too." The rest of the family had been alerted by the commotion and burst into the study. They had heard it all. Margaret gasped, tears running down her cheeks. Elizabeth shook her head in revulsion. David slurred. "You bloody idiot." Michael's doom was sealed. In the ensuing weeks, Michael's confession dismantled the Dalton facade. He was removed from his position in the company, publicly humiliated and exiled. Elizabeth had had enough of the poison, and stepped away from the empire. David continued his descent into his addictions, lost to the shadows of oblivion. Margaret, battered but strong, finally accepted the truth in her own mind. Richard betrayed her, but Daniel was not guilty. She started treating him not as an intruder, but as the hidden son that Richard had concealed. And Daniel, the empire was his now, but so was the curse. One night, Daniel stood in his father's office, reading Richard's final genuine letter once more. "My empire is not for one, but for all." Divide it fairly, or you will annihilate each other. He got it now. Richard's fortune had not been a blessing. It was a curse, one that could corrupt, divide, and devour anyone who came into contact with it. So Daniel made a shocking decision. During the next press conference, he appeared in front of the cameras, the burden of history on his shoulders. I am the son of Richard Dalton. That has been established. But I shall not be his sole beneficiary. My father desired that we share it. And that is precisely what I shall do. The Dalton dynasty will not be mine exclusively. It shall be restored as a foundation to benefit others. To mend, not ravage. The press went wild. Headlines blared. Secret son rocks the world. Dalton fortune to be divided. Daniel Dalton breaks family curse. It was late that evening when Daniel went to visit his mother Claire's grave. He knelt, and he had tears in his eyes. Mom, it's over. I know who I am now. And I know who father really was. He wasn't perfect. None of us are. But because of you, I found the strength to face them all. And because of him, I learned what not to become. He laid Richard's letter next to her headstone, allowing the wind to take with it the final whispers of the past. The Dalton dynasty would never be the same. The money, the prestige, the legacy, all of it had been marred by deception. But Daniel had set out on a different journey. One of truth, of healing, and of freedom. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the secret son. He felt like the rightful heir.